Thank you and good afternoon, and thank you, Kathy, for a warm welcome. Over the last year, members of Concerned Like Catholics and the Catholic Network for Women's Equality, which you're going to hear us say all afternoon, we say it by its acronym, CANWE, have been walking on the synodal path and discovering our common ground on that path. Thank you for inviting us to be in conversation with you today, and there are many of our members here, so I speak on behalf of them. We are grateful for the leadership of Concerned Like Catholics for initiating the Nurturing Synodality series. Our 25 minutes or less presentation today involves 4 CANWE members. Retired Professor of Theology Susan Roll will speak first, and she's coming to us today from Tilburg in the Netherlands. I will speak second. Lynne Lavictoire, a member of CANWE's National Work Group, will speak third. And Roman Catholic woman priest Roberta Fuller will close the presentation portion with a short meditation. CANWE member Nancy Kwan and members of the Women in the World Energy Circle in CANWE also contributed to this presentation. And now I'll turn it over to Susan.
Thank you, Mary Ellen. My title is Women Are Not Roles. In the Church, we are persons and always have been. We're going to do a quick zip through church history, naming eminent women, but also calling out the misogyny and contempt for women that's threaded its way all through that history. The earliest Christian communities were embedded in very patriarchal cultures around the Mediterranean. Still, they were doing something very new, and that gave them a lot of flexibility. From the New Testament letters, we have names of prominent women from that era. Phoebe, the deacon, Junia, who was called an apostle, Lydia, whose home was the meeting place for a house church, Dorcas, who cared for the poor, Eunice, and Lois. The Gospels were written later, and women's ministries were already disappearing in the Gospel of Luke. Nonetheless, we know of Mary of Magdala, who appears prominently in the Gospels, Photina, the Samaritan woman at the well, and women patrons who traveled with and supported Jesus' ministry, such as Joanna, Susanna, and others. We know of women's ministries in the 2nd to 4th centuries from visual evidence, such as the figure of Priscilla, painted on the wall of her catacomb, vested and presiding at a table. That's in your upper right-hand corner. We have a book, The Acts of Thecla, about a woman missionary who followed Paul and his companions on their journeys. Much later in the 9th century, there's a mosaic in the Basilica of St. Praxide in Rome of Episcopa Theodora, a woman bishop who was still living at the time. She's down on the left-hand corner. We know that women performed baptisms up to the 4th century until they were suppressed by certain church fathers. In the early church, the presbyters were simply elders. There were no men made priests by attending the Last Supper. Priests came much later. From the Middle Ages onward, we know the names and works of women mystics. Hildegard of Bingen in the 11th century, whose visions, music, and healing wisdom were well respected. Gertrude of Helfta, Mechtilde of Magdeburg, Marguerite Porete, and a host of mystics in the same period. In the early modern period, Catherine of Siena carried on an extensive correspondence. Teresa of Avila was the great reformer of monastic life, and there were many others. It was only in the 1970s that such women were granted the title of Doctor of the Church. And of course, we have many women founders of religious orders. So there were brilliant, respected, accomplished women of faith, and yet a powerful culture of contempt for women developed already in the early church and never let go. We have belittling, contemptuous writings against women from the late Roman period with the purpose of repressing women's ministries. In the Middle Ages, we have hideous screeds against women to force priests to reject their wives just when priestly celibacy became the law. Thomas Aquinas believed that a female was conceived because something went wrong in the process. and that women could never be priests because they were inferior by nature. Up to the 1950s, women were not allowed to touch the sacred vessels for Mass or open the tabernacle under threat of excommunication. A priest could legally forbid a woman lector to read from within the sanctuary. The long history of a churching rite for women after childbirth also points to a deep, visceral revulsion at the idea of women's bodies in the holy places. This may help explain why the official arguments against the ordination of women don't make sense. And yet, Catholic clergy and theologians risk losing their jobs and reputations for even suggesting dialogue. A proposal to ordain women came up and disappeared at Vatican II. Then another one was brought to the 1971 Synod of Bishops by Winnipeg Cardinal Flahiff, you see him on your left, on behalf of the Canadian bishops. Catholics in Canada saw their counterparts in the Anglican, United, and Evangelical Lutheran churches ordaining women. A U.S. grassroots movement began in 1975 at a Detroit meeting that later became the Women's Ordination Conference. By the early 1980s, similar organizations were founded in Canada, the UK, and elsewhere, organizations such as Can We. The Vatican pushed back hard, but the question of ordination gained traction, if anything, from the repression. In 1975, the Pontifical Biblical Commission ruled that nothing in Scripture could be used to forbid women's ordination. Still, in 1976, the Vatican issued the document Inter Insignioris that made three wobbly arguments against ordaining women. In 1995, Ordinatio Sacerdotalis repeated the ban and added that this was to be the definitive teaching. By then, the Church of England was ordaining women, and the TV news film spread across Europe, alarming the Vatican, and so they forbade discussion. In 2002, 7 women were ordained on a ship on the Danube, initiating the Roman Catholic women priests movement. These women are ordained in documented apostolic succession, according to the rites of the Catholic Church, validly, but not legally according to canon law. There are now some 300 Roman Catholic women priests worldwide. Feminist theology sprang up in academic institutions and local church circles of women starting in the 1970s, covering all aspects of theology: Scripture, moral theology and ethics from women's perspectives, systematic theology, liturgical imagery and language, a new look at the sacraments, and new interpretations of church history. One notable Canadian contributor was Ellen Leonard, whom you see here, whose work took its place among that of thousands of feminist theologians worldwide. I was recently asked by a young male doctoral student in theology whether I see any cracks in the stained glass ceiling. Because I was fresh from the demonstrations in Rome for women's full human dignity, including the sacrament of ordination, I told him, yes, a hairline crack. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. I'm now going to share briefly about Can We. The 70s and early 80s were a time of hope for the possibility of a co-responsible church. As many of you may remember, the Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops even created a parish discussion kit on women in the church. This really reflected the signs of the times, as for example, the United Nations declared a decade for women in 1976. Our movement began in January 1981, when 4 women theology students, the late Ellen Leonard, whose picture you just saw, Alexina Murphy, who I believe is on our call today from Victoria, Bernadette McMahon, and Judy Mayer plan to start a Canadian organization to work for the ordination of women in the Catholic Church. 6 months later, women from across Canada gathered, as you can see in this picture here, in Toronto, to craft a vision for a renewed Catholic Church. Their public statement called for the ordination of women. And with that, the movement had begun. In 1987, members discerned a wider vision, reflecting the interconnectedness of issues related to women both in the institutional church and in society. Members adopted a new name that we have continued with, the Catholic Network for Women's Equality. That vision has continued to evolve and is trifold. We work for justice and equality for women in the Catholic Church, women and families in the world, and for the care of all creation. I expect that many here can relate to the heartbreak and hope that has led to our 43 years of advocacy. Let me name a few. We are rooted in the Christian belief that all persons are made in the image of God, and we embrace the Vatican II vision of a renewing Catholic Church that honors the gifts of all the baptized. We lament the exclusion of women from ministry and leadership in the Church, and the sexism, misogyny, and clericalism that undergirds this, despite the evidence that Susan shared of women's leadership. We also lament that the beloved young people in our lives have walked away from the Church in large part due to its institutional shortcomings. Such a lost opportunity for next generations to be fed the bread of the gospel. We are angered by church teaching, language, and practice that excludes women, and we stand in solidarity with all who have had such experiences, especially to us LGBTQ+ persons, Indigenous peoples, and divorced Catholics who wish to remarry in the Church. We see a connection between how the Catholic Church, as an influential global institution, treating women as second-class citizens, serves to condone the same in societies. Until we as a church are part of the solution that models the equality of women, we are part of the problem. Additionally, we are heartbroken by the climate crisis, and so care of creation is interconnected to all our work. So you may ask, wherein lies our hope? Our hope lies in the light of the gospel and its radical call to inclusion, justice, and equality. We keep on keeping on in recognition that we are church. We who yearn for a more synodal church are in fact not on the margins, but at the center of an emerging church. And so as a network, we network, learn, act, and celebrate. And just a little bit about each of those. In terms of our network, while we meet in person in what we call local circles, we often now meet on Zoom in energy circles, focused on issues such as the synodal process and care for creation. We have a very active Google Groups e-list, a website, there you can see it, canwe.ca, and an active presence on Facebook. Since the beginning of CanWe, we have networked with other reform groups such as Water, Future Church, Women's Ordination Conference, Spirit Unbounded, and today with CLC. And I neglected to mention there, we've had a lovely newsletter for many years that we call the Sea Keepers. Like CLC, learning together is a fundamental aspect of CanWe. We often call on the wealth of wisdom among our own members, and we are inspired by the work of feminist theologians. Most recently, we collaborated with partner groups in Western Canada to hear Synod Delegate, Sister Elizabeth Davis. And in April, we will host a webinar with author Mary Condren, the author of The Serpent and the Goddess. Learning helps us to continually evolve, and the interconnectedness of creation is our great teacher. And we act. Over our 43 years, we have written scores of letters to Canadian bishops and invited them to be our dialogue partners. For example, when the new Roman Missal was implemented in Canada in 2010, we met with Bishop Terence Prendergast to express our concerns about its archaic and non-inclusive language. For many years in various parts of the country, as you can see from this top picture from New Brunswick, we held a vigil outside local cathedrals during Holy Week to protest the exclusion of women. We have also accompanied those hurt by clergy sexual abuse and cover-up and the injustice of the Vatican Marriage Tribunal process. In Toronto, around International Women's Day, we held a vigil against human trafficking for years and have materially supported Ernestine's, a women's shelter. In October, as you can see in the picture on the bottom, 9 of our members went to Rome at the start of the synod to be a presence for women around the globe who are calling for women's equal participation in the church. We joined in actions with other reform-minded groups, and we also met delegates Kathy Clifford and Sister Elizabeth Davis. Their impressions of the Synodal Assembly at that point gave us great hope that this synodal path will at last bear fruit. We regularly write media statements, and our connections with the press have helped us to get the word out about women's equality and has led to new members joining our movement. And celebrate. As with any group working on the long and sometimes slow road to justice and equality, we need times of celebration to keep us going. We ground our gatherings with creative prayer, song, and ritual, and have developed deep friendships in our work. We also choose to celebrate our diverse ways of being church. Some of us are in Catholic parishes. Some belong to communities led by Roman Catholic women priests. Others are part of intentional Christian or spiritual communities or progressive communities in other denominations. Our common ground is our Catholic roots and a vision for a church inclusive of all. We are sustained by our trust in a God who is love, a God who calls us to use our gifts to co-create a church and world where all belong, all are honored, all are fed, and where justice flows. I'm now going to turn it over to Lynne to share the third section of our presentation today.
Thank you, Mary Ellen. I'm going to address women's issues and the synodal process. As many of you know, early last spring, the 7 continental reports were published representing the fruit of the synodal discernment process carried out at the level of the continental assemblies. Specifically, these were reflections on the resonances, tensions, and priorities emerging from the original parish and diocesan synodal gatherings from around the world and gave a sense of the emerging high-level issues of concern. Looking at women's participation and leadership, there was universal recognition of the valuable role women play in the church, and that, as the North American report expressed, there can be no true co-responsibility in the church without fully honoring the inherent dignity of women. This is reflected in calls from all 7 continental assemblies to open the church for greater participation of lay women in all aspects, including ministry, governance, and decision-making. Here are some samples of what was said regarding women's participation in each of the continental reports, including the first statement from Africa, which said, "There is a call to create more opportunities and structures for women to do more in the church." The second statement from Oceania echoes this by saying, "Full and just participation of women in church governance, decision-making, ministry, and mission." The other 5 assemblies reflect similar supportive statements: North America, Latin America and the Caribbean, Asia, Europe, and Middle East. The issue of women's admission to the diaconate was discussed in 5 of the 7 continental reports. The African and Asian assemblies were mute on the subject. Only the Latin American Assembly considered this an urgent need, as shown in the first statement. The 4 other assemblies were more cautious. The second statement from the European Assembly said, women's access to ordained ministries is a divisive issue that must be studied in more depth. This same caution is reflected in the statements of the other three assemblies, North America, Middle East, and Oceania. Women's ordination to the priesthood received almost no attention. The Oceania report mentioned that the issue of women's ordination was only explicitly raised in one submission, while the European and Latin American reports alluded to the possibility of opening up ordained ministries to women. The Synod Synthesis Report, published last October, represents the most recent discernment stage, so it's interesting to see what did change. The report identified questions and themes considered to be priorities, organized into 3 major sections and subdivided into 20 subsections. Each subsection considered convergences, matters for consideration, and proposal. Subsection 9, Women in the Life and Mission of the Church, focused on women's issues, both women's participation and leadership, and women in the diaconate were discussed. Women in the priesthood, however, was not explicitly mentioned here or anywhere else in the report. So what did subsection 9 say that should give us hope? Under convergences, the report acknowledges that where dignity and justice are undermined in relationships between men and women in the church, we weaken the credibility of our proclamation to the world. However, one statement shown in the slide emphasizes the complementary and reciprocal relationship between men and women, which suggests a theology of differences rather than one of equality. Under matters for consideration, the need for women's participation in leadership was firmly recognized, leading to questions of how this should be implemented and who would do it. The women's diaconate was considered a controversial subject with views ranging from negative, breaking with tradition, or creating anthropological confusion, to positive, restoring early church practices and injecting new energy and vitality. In the proposals, changing the church at all levels to increase women's participation and decision-making was a strong recommendation. The women's diaconate was also considered to be an important issue, but one requiring further study. The report also encouraged the unpublicized findings from the 2 commissions on women deacons established by Pope Francis be made available for the next Synod of Bishops. So where do we go from here? In December, the General Secretariat of the Synod issued a letter entitled Towards October 2024, which provides guidance on what should happen between now and the next Synod of Bishops. Although these are diocesan level initiative, it begs the question, how can we be involved as an organization? A quick scan across the website of dioceses in 15 major cities across Canada found only 3 dioceses, Regina, Saskatchewan, St. John, New Brunswick, and St. John's, Newfoundland, who have published plans for diocesan initiatives. In light of the apparent current lack of diocesan activity, Canway drafted a statement last month that perhaps you've had a chance to read, as it was sent as a resource with the link for this webinar. It's also available on our website at canway.ca. One of our Canadian participants in the October Synod of Bishops, Sister Elizabeth Davis, said that we should embrace this chance to transform the church. It's an opportunity that's unlikely to come again for generations. Now is the time. So to close the presentation portion of our afternoon, I now ask Reverend Roberta Fuller to offer a short meditation.
Let us take a moment of reflection on these words adapted from Bishop Kenneth Tenner. It helps now and then to step back and take the long view. The kingdom is not only beyond our efforts, it is even beyond our vision. We accomplish in our lifetime only a fraction of the magnificent enterprise that is God's work. Nothing we do is complete, which is another way of saying that the kingdom always lies beyond us. No statement says all that could be said. No prayer fully expresses our faith. No confession brings perfection. No pastoral visit brings wholeness. No program accomplishes the church's mission. No set of goals and objectives includes everything. We cannot do everything, and there is a sense of liberation in realizing that. This enables us to do something and to do it well. It may be incomplete, but it is a beginning, a step along the way, an opportunity for the Lord's grace to enter and do the rest. We may never see the end results, but that is the difference between the master builder and the worker. We are workers, not master builders, ministers, not messiahs. We are prophets of a future, not our own. Amen to that. This was adapted from meditation by Bishop Kenneth Unterner and is also referred to as Archbishop Romano's prayer. Thank you.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for that really comprehensive presentation. It was very rich with lots of material for reflection in our small groups. Well, we're getting close to the end of our time. And so I would just reiterate what Mark said at the beginning. Next month, we have Nicholas Jessen from Regina, who is going to talk about ecumenism and the synodal process. And then we will be, we're going to be talking to folks about what they'd like to do, but we're thinking that the May session that's scheduled might be a wrap-up session because that's getting close to when the submissions have to go in. So Mark will be synthesizing all the feedback that we get from the groups, and then we will plan some kind of process at our May session to have a conversation with you about what we hear. We'll look for themes and synthesize what was shared, and then we can talk about where we'd like to go. So if you're interested in planning beyond May, for future synodal activities or things that we might take on, that would be a great session for you to attend. So that's our next two sessions. You know, CLC is about engaging lay people and empowering them to act where they live. And I think today we've met a lot of people who are acting where you live and also acting, as Mary Ellen said in her presentation, you've got local circles, but you've got energy circles. So this great thing that we got out of the pandemic is this ability to connect up through Zoom. And so we don't feel quite so alone if there's only a small group of us in a small place. But it also gives us the capacity to imagine something bigger. And so CLC is committed to engaging lay people and empowering them to act and to connecting them. We don't focus on any one issue. We really are about raising the voices of the laity and empowering them to do the work that's given to you to do. So each person has a passion that they want to give their energy to. And that's what we encourage you to do, is to find that passion and to bring that, because we believe that's the Holy Spirit working. And the diversity of gifts is what will take us where we need to go. Everybody doesn't have to do the same thing, but it's great if everybody does something. So we invite you to think about that and to Canway has lots of resources on their website. We have resources. There are other groups. Connect up with people and see what you can do where you live, and also stay in touch with people across the country, because maybe we can do something together. So we're going to finish with the words of Pope Francis and what the Synod means.
La misión está en el corazón de la iglesia. Y más aún, cuando una iglesia está en sínodo, solamente esa dinámica sinodal la lleva adelante la vocación misionera, es decir, la respuesta al mandato de Jesús de anunciar el Evangelio. Quisiera recordar que aquí no se acaba nada, sino que aquí continúa un camino eclesial. Se trata de un camino que recorremos como los discípulos de Maús, escuchando al Señor que siempre sale a nuestro encuentro. Es el Señor de la sorpresa. Por medio de la oración y el discernimiento, el Espíritu Santo nos ayuda a realizar el apostolado del oído, o sea, escuchar con los oídos de Dios para poder hablar con la palabra de Dios. Y así nos acercamos al corazón de Cristo, del que brota nuestra misión y la voz que atrae hacia Él. Una voz que nos descubre el centro de la misión, que es llegar a todos, buscar a todos, acoger a todos y buscar a todos sin excluir a nadie. Oremos por la Iglesia para que adopte la escucha y el diálogo como estilo de vida a todos los niveles, dejándose guiar por la fuerza del Espíritu Santo hacia las periferias del mundo.
So thank you again. I just can't, I just want to say before we leave, I can't thank the Canway delegation enough. So much work, so much thought, so much care went into your presentation. And we just appreciate so much that you shared that with us today. So big round of applause for our Canway presenters today. And we certainly hope that we continue to find ways to bring this idea of synodality into the bigger church, into the Canadian church for sure. That's where we're focusing. All right. So thanks everyone and God bless. And hope to see you again next month for Nicholas Jessen.